Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a very good lunch, and I'm delighted that you're all here on this wonderful day and not playing bridge or golf, because Larry Goldstone is really worth listening to. Larry is not only an old friend, but he's somebody that I listen to if I want to learn something about constitutional law or a lot of other subjects that we're going to touch on today. Just briefly, he is the author or co-author of more than 24 books. I don't know when he sleeps, 6 of which he wrote with his wife, Nancy, who is also a biographer and here with us today. And they are still talking to one another, which is amazing. He's written on a huge, a wide range of subjects, and I'm not going to read all of the books or we'd be here all afternoon. And instead, I just want to say that when I asked him for a formal bio, he told me something I did not know, which in addition to just being an extremely good translator of very complicated legal concepts into English that most of us would speak, he also holds a PhD in constitutional history from the New School. But he's been a teacher, lecturer, senior member of a Wall Street trading firm, taxi driver, actor, quiz show contestant, and policy analyst at the Hudson Institute. Now that's what I call a resume. So without further ado, I want to just say one more thing, which is his new book is coming out. They were supposed to be copies of the books here today. They have not arrived. Thank you, United States Postal Service. But they will be here. They're going to be here in the afternoon or the evening. And if you wish to purchase a book, you could speak to Debbie after this event, and she will be glad to take your information and make sure that you get a copy. It's a terrific, terrific book. I've just read excerpts of it. It's called Imperfect Union, basically, I'm going to let him tell you all about it. So thank you, Larry, for coming here from sunny Del Mar, California. Most people come from New York, right? No. He comes from one sunny place to another. Thank you for joining us, Larry, and please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Judy, for that lovely introduction. Who said that $10 doesn't buy anything anymore? I will say, before I start, the 6 books Nancy and I wrote together, 5 of them we had a shared vision. And on the 6th, our vision diverged. And we now write separately. One of the reasons is, we stopped writing together to save what was left of the dishes. And one of the reasons we stopped writing is that it's on Nancy's website, but it was my line. Just. One of your lines, you took one of mine. Yes, and we are still talking to each other. We've been married almost 40 years, so. We are going to talk about the Constitution. I am struck by this wonderful venue, looking out over the water. And the contrast between this room and the room in which the Constitution was written is rather stark. The Constitutional Convention met, as some of you know, Mike's good, between May and September in 1787 in Philadelphia. It was a particularly warm summer in Philadelphia. The temperature reached 90 degrees on many of the days. And they met in the State House in Philadelphia, now called Independence Hall, which is not a very large room. And there were 55 delegates, and they were never all there at one time, but there were like 30 people stuffed in this room. And because they didn't want any eavesdropping, for reasons that will become clear later in the talk, the windows were kept closed and locked. The doors were kept locked with guards outside. Now, these delegates didn't always really like each other, and got kind of warm. Now, the southern delegates had these light linen suits, but the northern delegates often dressed in wool. And as some of you know, when you perspire into wool, it can get kind of malodorous. So here are these people, 4 months, stuffed together in a room, trying to hash out this document that is going to be the ruling document for the United States. I think that if they had been meeting here in this room, which is bigger than Independence Hall, looking out over the water, we might have had a very different Constitution. Now, that's kind of a joke, but there is one element of the Constitution that was directly impacted by the conditions under which they met, which I will come to later. So, let's talk about the Constitution. It is the most revered, the most well-known document in American history, and what is remarkable about it is how few people actually know what it says, and even fewer know what it was supposed to mean. If you asked 100 people, was the Constitution written to increase liberty? 98 would say yes, and 98 would be wrong. The Constitution was not written to increase liberty, just the opposite. Under the Articles of Confederation, which was the ruling document at the time in 1787, Americans had a ton of liberty. Every state had its own constitution, its own monetary system, its own militia, its own rules for voting, its own rules for naturalizing citizens, its own executive, its own trading rules. Sometimes you had to pay tariffs to trade from one state to another. In other words, each of these 13 states functioned pretty much as an independent nation. And in addition to that, almost every American identified first as a member of their state, and only secondarily as a member of this vague concept called the United States, a term, by the way, that was only brought into use after the Articles of Confederation John Dickinson wrote, which I'll talk about in a minute. For example, one of the most important delegates to the Constitutional Convention was a man named John Rutledge, who had been, I might have got the first name wrong, who had been governor of South Carolina, and like all the other delegates from South Carolina, he had been educated in England. In 1785 or 1786, he came to New York, where Congress was meeting, to sit in Congress for a brief period of time, and he wrote to his mother that his trip to New York was his first visit to a foreign country. This was the man who had been educated in England. So what you had here was this enormous identification with a state, with the United States kind of being this more or less vague concept that they understood that they had one country, but people had lots of different ideas on how that country would be constituted. And as I said, it was the ruling document was the Articles of Confederation, which was ratified in 1781. What people don't realize is that in June of 1776, Congress authorized 3 committees. One, to write a Declaration of Independence, which they did relatively quickly. One, to create a framework for trading with foreign governments, which the country desperately needed if it was going to fight for independence. And that kind of never really got going. And the third was a document to take the independence that the Declaration was going to establish and put together some framework for making this one country. And it took 5 years because the states did not want to give up power, and they demanded unanimity in order to bring it to be ratified. And they went through at least 6 or 7 drafts. They voted on it, they voted it down, they changed it, they voted it down, they changed it. Finally, in 1781, they had 12 states willing to do it, and Maryland was the only holdout. And Maryland became like that one small retail shop that doesn't sell in the face of the shopping center that is going to be put in that area, and they could make a great deal for themselves. And Maryland did make a pretty good deal for themselves. So in 1781, the Articles were ratified. And because the states were so jealous of their independence, the Articles were a remarkably weak document. There was no executive, there was no judiciary. Congress had one house, a legislature. Voting was by state. It took 9 states to do anything and 13 to amend it. So everyone had to agree if they wanted to change the Articles. It had already taken them 5 years to put into force. And it was kind of voluntary. In fact, it was called a compact of friendship. And this is between a lot of states that weren't actually really all that friendly with each other. They could assess taxes, but they had no means to collect them. Now, in 1781, the war was still going on. Washington needed troops. He needed money because the troops often had not been paid, and he needed supplies. Now, under the Articles, each state could be asked to contribute, but there was no means to get them to actually do it. And many of the states simply ignored these requests. And in one case, for example, Virginia, the Virginia governor was asked to send troops. He was assessed a certain number of troops, and the Virginia governor refused to send troops to help Washington's army because they were needed to remain in Virginia to guard against slave revolts. And the governor of Virginia at that time was Thomas Jefferson. And Washington and Jefferson, and this infuriated Washington, and it made Washington a very fervent nationalist. There were some nationalists around, but not all that many. But the ones that existed recognized that this country couldn't function if they had no means to collect taxes, they had no means to raise money, they had no means to have a standing army, they had no means to trade. Under the Articles, each state was allowed to make a treaty with a foreign government on its own. So the country, the war is over in 1785, 1786. The war is over, but the country is still failing. And a group of nationalists got together, and most of them, the most prominent were John Dickinson. He was from Pennsylvania and from Delaware. He was the man who wrote the Articles of Confederation. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They contrived, and it was a total contrivance, to get Congress to authorize a convention in Philadelphia to begin to meet in May of 1787 in order to revise the Articles. Nobody was going to come and scrap the Articles. There would have been too much resistance because the states guarded their independence very carefully and very fervently. And again, people thought, South Carolinians thought, I'm a South Carolinian first. In fact, Patrick Henry famously said, I am no longer a Virginian, I am now an American. Which is ironic because in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Patrick Henry was the leading force in trying to have the Constitution rejected. Patrick Henry, most people don't give me liberty or give me death, but Patrick Henry was a really interesting character. He was perhaps the best trial lawyer in America. In one case, there was a murder case with one of the Randolph families, one of the first families of Virginia, and one of the Randolph family was accused of murdering a female servant. And in this case, one of the witnesses against Randolph, and Henry was the defense lawyer, and one of the witnesses against Randolph was an elderly woman who claimed to have passed by the room in which it was happened and saw what was happening. But Henry kind of established that the door was probably closed at the time. So he said, Madam, when you peeked through the keyhole, which eye did you use? And the jury erupted in laughter, and Randolph was acquitted. So again, so you have this process. So they get this convention together. In theory, mostly for commercial reasons. A lot of it had to do with Maryland again and Virginia and their trading and who owned the Potomac and who owned Chesapeake Bay, and there had been other conventions. But in any event, it was a total contrivance. And they show up in order, and Madison, of course, and Hamilton, and some of the other nationalists, they know that what they're there to do is to scrap the articles totally and to start over. But how do you do that? Well, in order to have a stronger central government, if you're going to be able to demand taxes instead of just ask for them, if you're going to have a country that can only make treaties with other countries rather than the states, you are going to need a stronger central government. But a stronger central government means weaker state governments. All the power you are granting to the central government, you are taking away from the states. So this notion that the Constitution was written to increase liberty is wrong. The Constitution was written and instituted to limit liberty. Now you say, wait a second, this is about the states. What about people? Wasn't it instituted to increase individual liberty? No. If Palm Beach were a country, everybody here, I mean, assuming that you vote here, everyone here would have a certain degree of power at the ballot box in order to make the laws that you thought were right for Palm Beach. You'd have this small, contiguous area that had the right to make its own laws and decide the way they wanted to be governed. But Palm Beach is not a country, so Palm Beach has to be subordinate. Hold my calls, please. Palm Beach has to be subordinate to the state of Florida. But the state of Florida also has to be subordinate to the United States. So every time you add a layer of government, every time you add one layer of government that is superior to the ones that came before, you are decreasing the liberty, you are decreasing the authority that each individual has in this larger government. And that sounds, you may say, well, that doesn't sound right. Well, it is right. And they all knew it. Every one of these delegates who showed up in Philadelphia recognized, either positively or negatively, that they were there to limit the authority of the states, that they were there to create a central government. As soon as Madison presented the Virginia plan, or Edmund Randolph did, they were there to create a system whereby the states were going to lose some of these powers that they really, really wanted to keep. So how do you do that? Well, one thing they did, which was really slick, was that they only required 9 states to ratify this new document, rather than all 13. By the way, only 12 states sent delegates. Rhode Island refused. Rhode Island was this freewheeling commercial state that was nicknamed Rogues Island, and they didn't send anybody. But 55 delegates from 12 states did come. So how do you do it? How do you limit liberty and get 9 states to approve it? And this was even a dicier problem because 2 of the states where there was enormous resistance to changing the articles, one was Virginia, led by Patrick Henry. And by the way, in the ratifying convention, which I'm not going to have time to talk about, it was Henry against James Madison, and they went at it. And Henry was a breathtaking orator. He could speak for 8 hours at a time, and people said they hardly breathed. And he was bested by Madison, who was very tiny and had a very soft voice, but Madison had great arguments. So Virginia was going to be a real problem, and the other problem was New York, Alexander Hamilton's state. And if New York didn't ratify the Constitution, the country would be cut in half, would be cut in 2. So here you are, and you're trying to figure out, how do we make a stronger central government and still not annoy the states so much that they just walk out, which, by the way, many threatened to do all through those 4 months. And the way you do that, kind of, is you don't make the central government that strong. If you do too much, they're going to leave. If you do too little, it isn't going to work. So they're trying to find a balance. And the way they found a balance was to leave stuff out. There were a couple of enormous issues that the delegates recognized that if they were too aggressive about, one state or another wasn't going to ratify it. And remember, you had all sorts of problems. You had slave states who wanted protection of slavery. You wanted the northern states who wanted protection for the free flow of commerce. You had some states with claims to western lands, which, by the way, went to the Southern Sea, according to the royal charters, the Southern Sea being the Pacific Ocean, which they initially thought was 150 miles from the Atlantic coast, and then realized after these charters were granted that it was actually a good deal farther than that. So technically, Virginia owned all with the border all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and some states did not have any claims to western lands, and they did not want to fund what was going to turn out to be other states, making a ton of money from land speculation and all sorts of other things. So all of these issues made it impossible to deal with some of the major problems. I'll give you one primary example. One of the issues, and it came up in the ratifying conventions, one of the places where there was enormous resistance was a federal court system, a national court system. Now they kind of knew that they needed a national court because maritime law, disputes between states, some other things, but a national court system, forget it. Because every time you give power to the national court system, you are taking power away from the state courts. Every state, as I said, had its own judicial system, they had its own laws, their own interpretation. So if every time, in the same way as Palm Beach becomes less of an autonomous entity when you put Florida and the United States over it, the federal court system is going to take power away from state courts. And there was enormous resistance to this. So what did they do? Well, you can tell when you look at the Constitution. You look at Article 1, which is the legislature, really long, lots of specifics, because every state had a legislature, they debated it, they knew what they wanted to do, really long. Article 2, the executive, it's long, but not quite as long, because they knew they wanted a chief executive, they didn't want a king, well, that will come up later. But how do you do it? Well, they kind of had an idea, although it took 60 votes to actually end up with Article 2, and one of them had a lot to do with the lack of bucolic setting that I mentioned before. But then you look at Article 3, the judiciary, and it's this big, 6 paragraphs, and only 4 of them actually have to do with the courts. Because that was something if they took on, it was going to be a serious problem. Now, as I said, they knew they needed a Supreme Court. Now, we're going to do a 3-question quiz here. How many justices does the Constitution specify should be on the Supreme Court? Anyone know? No, they didn't say 0. No, it doesn't. It doesn't specify it at all. It just says there will be a Supreme Court. What does the Constitution say about how other courts, district courts, circuit courts, how other courts will be constituted? What does the Constitution say about that? Nothing. This is the kick the can down the road school of government. It said Congress will do it. And that was, by the way, the first, what Congress did in 1789 is the Judiciary Act, which caused enormous problems when John Marshall run it in Marbury, but we don't have time for that. Here's the last question. In the following list, who is not eligible to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court? Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, Elon Musk, John Gotti Jr., or Vladimir Putin? Who is not eligible? Anybody? They're all eligible. Vladimir Putin is constitutionally eligible to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There are no requirements to be a federal judge. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be a citizen. Now, there are requirements to be a member of Congress, and there are requirements to be president. There are no requirements to be a federal judge. And again, this was their way of end running that problem. Now, if you read a lot of scholars, I could say lesser scholars, but I won't because I'm a generous guy, they will say, well, there were things in the Constitution they didn't put in. Well, it was 1787. They didn't know, they didn't anticipate all the problems we were going to have as a country. Hooey. If you read the debates, they got it. They knew exactly what the problems would be. They had a real sense, and what you read over and over again is, we can't do this because the states will reject it. Sometimes the state, a specific state, anything that threatens slavery, South Carolina, or they thought South Carolina would threaten to walk out. Anything that's threatened the free flow of commerce, Massachusetts would threaten to walk out. So it's not that they didn't know what problems would exist, it's they didn't want to deal with it. There's another aspect of Article 3. And this is extra credit on the quiz. What does Article 3 say about the Supreme Court's role in determining whether a law is constitutional? Nothing. Oh, everybody kind of got it by now? Yes, nothing. What is called judicial review, which was kind of hijacked by John Marshall and Marbury. Again, if you want, I can talk about it in questions, but if there is nothing, and if you read, I wrote a whole book on this called The Activist. If you read a lot of scholarship, they will say, well, yeah, but the delegates, they recognized, they understood kind of implicitly that the Supreme Court was going to have the power to declare a law unconstitutional. No, they didn't. And they usually cite the Virginia Constitution and the Massachusetts Constitution. They didn't. In fact, again, if you read the debates, and actually read the debates as this is a group of people, like a business meeting, sitting down, hashing out ideas, instead of these are a group of latter-day Athenians discussing political theory, you get what they're about. They did not want to grant the Supreme Court power. And if you think about it, it's logical. Here they spend 4 months crammed together, hot, miserable, frustrated, trying to create a system that would not create tyranny or not promote tyranny. Does it really make sense that they're going to give an unelected group of people, however number there turned out to be, this almost unlimited power? So judicial review is not mentioned. And my sense of reading the debates, and I said I wrote a book on it, is that most of the delegates assumed that that would not be the case. But when you have omissions, when you leave stuff out, you create a vacuum. And into that vacuum can rush political points of view on either side. And that is what happened in 1803 in Marbury. Now, how do we know that what I'm saying is right? I know it. My wife knows it. Or she pretends to know it. And actually somebody told us. And the man who told us is Alexander Hamilton. Now, I don't know, how many of you saw the play? Okay. Now, in the play, they make a very big deal that Hamilton spoke for 6 hours at the Constitutional Convention and the delegates sat there rapt. Well, that part is true. Well, half true. He did speak on June 18th, 1787. Hamilton spoke for 6 hours at the Constitutional Convention, but the other delegates weren't rapt. They were aghast. Because what Hamilton proposed was abolishing the states, implementing a chief executive very much like a king. He says right in the talk, the British system is the best system ever devised, and made a number of other proposals that even his supporters said. One of them, William Samuel Johnson of Connecticut, said, everyone is impressed by him. Basically, everyone was impressed by him, but nobody agreed with him. It was so bad that the next day, Hamilton had to come back and say he didn't mean it. No, I didn't mean to abolish the states. No, I don't really want a king. And then after that, he left. He left the convention in late June, and other than a couple of days, he was gone for the rest of it. He only returned in September because the other two New York delegates had left. They were totally against the Constitution, and he would be the only New Yorker to sign the Constitution. And if you look, it's Alexander Hamilton and nobody else. So Hamilton's system of government was very different than the Constitution eventually turned out. And his role of the courts was also very different than, okay, let's back up a little. For the New York Ratifying Convention, I said it was going to be a really tough go in New York. The Anti-Federalists were very powerful, and in those days, people used to do kind of op-eds, broadsides, and they wouldn't say their name. And so an anti-federalist, someone against the Constitution, named Brutus, who was probably a Robert Yates, but we don't know for sure, started writing a series of articles which eviscerated the Constitution. He said, no, this isn't going to hurt, this is not going to prevent tyranny, it's going to encourage it. Brutus wrote 18 articles, 5 of them were devoted to the courts. In one, he said, and this is in the book in more detail, in one of he says about the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court's power was such, there is no appeal, that they essentially were anointed to be a government unto themselves. In response, all of a sudden, a couple of weeks later, other articles start appearing, written by Publius. And nobody knew who Publius was, nobody knew who Brutus was, and Publius is defending the Constitution. Now, it wasn't until 1804 that people found out who Publius was, because as his duel with Aaron Burr was coming near, Hamilton wrote that it was John Jay who wrote the first 5, and Hamilton and Madison, James Madison, had split the rest. And Hamilton, totally in character, claimed credit for 10 of them that later were revealed to have been written by Madison. But the one that Hamilton did write was Federalist 78. And Federalist 78 is among the best known of the Federalist essays. And it talks about the courts. According to Hamilton, the courts were not going to be this power to uphold the king's authority as it was in his plan on June 18th. The courts were going to be the people's branch of government. The courts were going to be there to protect the people against encroachments by the legislature. And he said famously, I think at Federalist 80, that the Supreme Court was going to be the weakest of the three branches. So here you have Hamilton writing an essay to persuade the people of New York to ratify the Constitution, which they ultimately did, saying stuff he didn't believe. And just parenthetically, the Federalist essays, which are cited by judges and Supreme Court justices on both sides, conservative and liberal, as an accurate record of what happened in the Constitutional Convention or political theory or what they were thinking, that's hooey. They're op-eds. That's like saying, I don't know some far left or far right op-ed writer is writing accurate theoretical stuff. In fact, I have a chapter in the book called Unreliable Narrator, because the Federalist essays are filled with distortions, outright falsehoods, convenient reasoning. But so here Hamilton is writing this to persuade everyone to do something that he clearly didn't believe. But ultimately, they were successful because New York narrowly ratified the Constitution, as did Virginia, because Madison bested Patrick Henry, and ultimately all 13 states kind of reluctantly, some very reluctantly, came on board, and we ended up with the Constitution. I don't want to go deep into the weeds here, but I'm just going to touch on one other area, and that's voting rights. For national elections, just about every delegate recognized if you're going to have a national election, you should have basically the same rules in every state to elect people who are going to represent the national government. But that was also a non-starter. There was voting rights in each of the 13 states. They could make their own, or a hodgepodge. In 4 states, you couldn't vote if you were a Catholic. In 3 states, you couldn't vote if you were a Jew. And some states, only 3 states were black people specifically forbidden to vote, but in many cases they weren't. And in New Jersey, by a quirk in their constitution, women who owned property were allowed to vote. They fixed that in 1807 and took women, so women couldn't vote anymore. They were like, whoa, we goofed. The voting rules, the one thing that was relatively consistent was that you had to own property, real property. And if you read the writings of John Adams and Hamilton and Madison, real property, land. And in almost every state, you had to be a landowner. In many cases, you had to have 50 acres. In some cases, you could pay taxes on property of a certain amount. The only state, I think, that didn't have a specific property owning provision was New Hampshire. So the idea of implementing a set of rules that were going to apply to each state equally was that simply wasn't going to happen. And again, we know this because the delegates told us. There was somebody proposed national voting standards, and Oliver Ellsworth, a Connecticut delegate, said, we can't do this because states guard these prerogatives very jealously. Now, Ellsworth is an interesting character because he was one of the best legal scholars at the convention. He ultimately co-wrote the Judiciary Act of 1789, and was either the second or third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, depending on how you count. Because what happened was the first Chief Justice was John Jay, and the Supreme Court had so little to do at the time that Jay accepted a diplomatic assignment in England and felt no need to resign his Chief Justiceship, but he ultimately did resign. And giving in to enormous pressure by someone who desperately wanted the job, Washington appointed John Rutledge, the guy who visited the foreign country of New York, which actually, saying the foreign country of New York, where I live in California, that's not as much of a non sequitur. But he appointed Rutledge. Now, Rutledge at the convention was an immensely powerful delegate. He headed the Committee of Detail, which drew up the prototype Constitution. We don't have time to go into that, but by the way, if you're interested, those books will be here. Anyway, Rutledge gets appointed, starts to sit on cases, but before he is confirmed, rumors start that he had lost his mind. People said they witnessed him chewing on silverware. This is all true. And what really happened, though, is he had turned on Washington and was very much opposing some of Washington's policies. So Rutledge was never confirmed, and Oliver Ellsworth came next. So people usually do not count Rutledge as the second Chief Justice, but that's up to you. But the rumors that he had lost his mind might not have been totally false, because after the Senate refused to ratify his nomination, Rutledge returned home and, in despair, threw himself into Charleston Harbor with the intention of killing himself. And in one of the great ironies, Rutledge had been the most ferocious and unapologetic defender of slavery at the convention and maybe in the country. And one of the great historical ironies was as Rutledge is in Charleston Harbor trying to drown himself, 2 slaves jumped in the water and saved him. They pulled him out, and Rutledge was clearly not altogether happy about this, because after that he became a recluse and he died 5 years later. So, I just want to tell you one, before we go back to voting, which I'll kind of finish up with, I have to tell you about one of the other delegates. See, one of the real fun parts of what I do, which is to look at all this from the political point of view, is I really look at the people. And there was a delegate from Maryland named Luther Martin. Now, Luther Martin was a ferocious opponent of the Constitution. He was a really smart guy. He was Maryland's Attorney General for almost 2 decades. But Luther Martin had another talent. Luther Martin could drink. Luther Martin could drink perhaps more than any human being that ever lived. You could not get Luther Martin drunk. Every night, every day after the convention adjourned, many of the delegates often went to one of the local taverns to hoist a few. Well, what Luther Martin would do was to make sure that everyone kept drinking. And they would basically slide under the table, and he would be just fine. And the next day he would come in, and at one point someone said, Luther Martin has his finger on the very pulse beat of the proceedings, because everybody would talk and tell him what they were going to say, and he would walk in the next morning. Now, there's one more Luther Martin story. Luther Martin was, as a private attorney, had a very, very lucrative case brought by a group of Quakers. And something he wanted a lot. There was a lot of money involved. And they made a stipulation, though. They were Quakers. They made him swear not to drink a drop during the trial. And Luther Martin discovered that while he could function very well, basically with 80 proof blood, he couldn't really function all that well without it. And he was doing poorly. So how does he solve the problem? This is true, by the way. At an adjournment, he purchases a bottle of brandy, and like a pound cake, and he pours the bottle of brandy over the cake, cuts the cake, eats it, has his alcohol fix, goes back and wins the case, and kept his word never to drink a drop. See, I mean, I love history. This is what's fun. You don't find this in most people's books, but I'm drawn to this. And by the way, Nancy, who writes European history, we're the same in that. You're drawn to the human behavior, and it does explain a lot. So getting back to voting rights. So there are no national voting rights. And in Article 1, as many of you know, each state has the right to create rules and the time and place of elections, which has caused enormous controversy. If there had been national voting rights, there would have been no need for the Voting Rights Act. There would have been no need for a lot of the legislation that you have now. If we had had national standards in Florida a few years ago, as all of you I'm sure know, by a 2/3 vote, Florida voters chose to allow felons who had completed their sentences and paid all their debts to vote. Florida was one of the 4 states in the Union at the time that you could not vote if you had ever been convicted of a felony for the rest of your life. Only one of 4 states. Now, Florida is a state, it's a red state now, but it isn't a red state by 2/3 to 1/3. So that means that a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans voted for this constitutional amendment on the grounds of fairness. But the governor and this Florida legislature wasn't going to stand for that, because of these disenfranchised former felons, they were disproportionately black. I think there were 450,000 black former felons. And so what they did was they passed a law which said that not only does a felon have to complete his sentence and pay off all the fines, but they have to pay off any costs or interest that is accrued. And in many cases, these people didn't even know that these charges existed. And a couple of them tried to vote and were arrested. Now, however you believe voting rights should be, the notion that this kind of end running of what the people of Florida overwhelmingly favored would never have come up if there were national voting rights. If there were national voting standards, let's call them that, that would mean that the Congress of the United States would always have to pass a law saying exact match ID, address, whatever it is. Again, only in national elections. State elections, states can do what they want. And as a result, you have all of these disparities in different states which are not making the republic stronger. Again, this isn't a conservative or liberal issue. This is an issue that said, if you want to have more trust in government, the better the standards, the more equitable the standards, the more common the standards, the more trust you can have. I mean, there's still going to be people who end run this and end run that and contrive, but the firmer the standards, the more equity you have through the national system, the more trust you're going to have that these things were created properly. One more quick thing. I said to you that that the Sailfish Club might have resulted in a different constitution. How to elect a president, they just went through. It was torture. Popular vote, out of the question. Do the states vote? Do the state legislatures vote? Again, I said 60 votes. They had rejected everything. Finally, in September, early September, they had only a couple of issues left. One of them was, how do you elect a president? And what they did, what they always did, they gave it to a committee. They appointed a committee. And the committee came out with a proposal that had been rejected 3 other times, almost unanimously, and that was the Electoral College. Nobody wanted the Electoral College. But they were so sick of being there that they voted almost unanimously, this is true, to implement the Electoral College as a means to elect the president. And I'll tell you again, this is how we know. James Madison told us, because he wrote in a letter to a friend some years later, that the only reason the Electoral College was enacted because the delegates had grown so tired and so impatient to leave that they were going to accept just about anything. So, I mean, here you have the Electoral College, which is kind of an enormous issue, and nobody wanted it because popular vote was not going to happen. Now, from here, and one more thing I want to say. I love doing this, as I think I've made clear, but why is it important to other people? Well, that the country is in a fraught political state is pretty clear no matter which side of the political spectrum you are. It seems to me that if we are ever going to solve these problems, one of the things we need to do is to understand this document that in theory rules us. And it is the lack of awareness, the lack of understanding, particularly by many people who spout the Constitution, again, both sides, which simply exacerbate the problems. So for me, the best way, a way to try to close the divide, which this country will have to do, is to understand what our founding document, what the supreme law of the land, as the Constitution is, actually does. Now, I could talk for probably 3 or 4 more hours, and often have, but I would prefer answering questions if you have any. So, does anyone? Oh, Fred, you're rubbing your hands together gleefully. Fred is a journalist known for his vicious attack on innocent speakers standing at podia.
Well, let me begin the attack by saying I enjoyed your speech very, very much.
Oh, Fred, don't do that to me.
Very impressed with your scholarship. But I wanted to ask you about something that just does seem to me a bit of a contradiction, and that is one of your theses, I think, is that we need more specificity on outstanding issues that are lacking in the Constitution. And I wonder how you square that with the 10th Amendment and with the very famous observation by Justice Brandeis that the states are laboratories of democracy, that it's a good thing, not a bad thing, that everything is not defined, say, in the Constitution.
Okay, well, that was much milder than I expected. I'm touched. You square that very easily. Nobody said we should abolish the states, and nobody said that there are not issues within which state points of view should be dominant over federal points of view. There is something about the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment, by the way, the 10th Amendment reserves all powers not specifically granted to the United States to the states or the people. And that was used to justify slavery and all sorts of other evils until 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified. Now, the 14th Amendment, because, okay, the Bill of Rights, those 10, by the way, one quick thing, the Bill of Rights had been soundly rejected unanimously in the last weeks of the convention. Madison being against them, we don't need a Bill of Rights, but along with the federal court system, the lack of a Bill of Rights was one of the big deals in the ratifying convention, and Madison in Virginia said, oh yes, I will institute a Bill of Rights, as soon. He wanted to be a senator, but Patrick Henry snookered him out of that, and then he barely beat James Monroe to be in Congress. And Madison did initiate the Bill of Rights. But the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. Congress shall pass no law. Congress, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. There was no freedom of speech in the states constitutionally. There was no freedom of religion in the states constitutionally. Congress shall pass no law, and that is the way it was ruled until 1868, when the 14th Amendment was passed, guaranteeing each person, not each citizen, every person equal protection of the law, due process of law, and the privileges and immunities of citizenship. So what the 14th Amendment did was to say, yes, the states retain a good deal of their power, but there are areas in which you cannot deny people equal protection. Now, 14th Amendment law there's probably more 14th Amendment law than any other amendment, any other provision of the Constitution. So, what you have here is, yes, the states deserve a certain degree of autonomy and a certain degree of discretion in what they want to do, but when it passes a certain threshold, and if you say, where is the threshold? That's the question, isn't it? It passes a certain threshold, then the national government, the federal government, has a right to limit that discretion to there are all sorts of places, voting rights, things of that nature, all sorts of discriminatory practices, and this was obviously instituted after the Civil War to protect the rights of the 4 million newly freed slaves, freedmen they were called, who were also, after the Civil War, Andrew Johnson was president, and he allowed the states to institute what were called black codes. And the black codes were basically slavery without slavery. And the radical Republicans, who kind of, they not numerically, but controlled Congress, put through the 14th Amendment, which states, the southern ex-Confederate states, were required to ratify before being readmitted to the Union, to protect the rights of the freedmen and get rid of the black codes. Now, 14th Amendment law, as you know, has become enormously complicated. Whether birthright citizenship, there are all sorts of things about it. So I don't disagree with you, but I think again, this is a continuum, and where does it fall? Where does the 10th Amendment end and the 14th Amendment begin, or vice versa? So that's an incomplete answer, but it's an incomplete issue. And yes?
I want to ask a question about the Electoral College. This is the law. This is supposedly the law of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that what you're implying is that this is not the law of the United States.
Oh no, it is absolutely the law of the United States, but it is a law that nobody really wanted all that much. The Electoral College was the last alternative. You ever see the movie Argo, which is a really good movie, and when Ben Affleck and Bryan Cranston are in trying to sell this idea of doing a movie, he said, they're all bad ideas. And he said, what's the least bad idea? He said, well, this is the least bad idea. Well, the Electoral College was seen as the least bad idea because the other alternatives were a popular vote, which the slave states would never have agreed to because their power, there were 700,000 slaves, there were more slaves in Virginia than whites, 250,000. So the slave states are never going to agree to a popular vote. The other thing was having the state legislatures choose the president, and the large states, like Virginia, were never going to let it be a bi-state, give Rhode Island and New Jersey the same rights as Virginia and Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And the other was to appoint electors, have the state legislatures appoint electors, have Congress appoint the president. They went through all of these. Everyone was proposed more than once, and everyone was rejected. And at the end, somebody said, okay, we'll do the Electoral College. We got to do something. I can't stand sitting next to this guy one more week. And it really was pretty close to that, because if you read the correspondence of the delegates after they left, there was a lot of vitriol. So it is the law, but it was a law no one really wanted mainly because popular election of the president simply was not an alternative. Yes?
Can you relate the decision?
Sorry, he's next. Yes, go ahead.
The decision that came down, or the discussion now today about states' rights with respect to Texas and what the Supreme Court did in its decision yesterday, that relates to what you were just talking about, where you draw the line, right?
Right. That's a good question. Okay. As many of you know, Texas has instituted a law that they can arrest migrants on their own and send them back and deport them, and they are taking power that has been reserved to the federal government, and Governor Abbott is making a point and saying, federal government's not doing enough, so we're going to do it. And there was a lawsuit in district court and then circuit court, and the circuit court froze the law until it was going to be adjudicated. They didn't annul the law. They just said you can't put it into effect until this is run through the judicial system. So Texas appealed to the Supreme Court an emergency petition, which goes to only one justice, and it went to Samuel Alito because Alito oversees that circuit, a very conservative circuit, by the way. And Alito said, no, you still have to, you can put the law into effect, you can start arresting and deporting migrants while this case is still being adjudicated. But this is going to we're kicking this back to circuit court. And then it went back to the Court of Appeals. Then it went back to circuit court, and the circuit court said, no, we're still going to adjudicate it, but no, you can't put it into effect. So in the kick the can down the road theory of government that I mentioned earlier, this is the hot potato theory of government. No, I don't want to do it. No, you do it. No, you do it. So, and what the circuit, and again, this has no impact on whether or not the law will eventually be declared unconstitutional. Now, to me, this is really, there's no way of knowing. there's no way of knowing what the court will do, but it seems a pretty clear instance of where the federal government's authority would be superior to that of the states. I said this to a bunch of other people. About 100 years ago, there was a baseball umpire, a National League umpire named Bill Clem, a famous umpire. He's the guy who drew a line and he said, you cross this line, you're out of the game. That's where they got line in the sand, by the way. A runner from third had dashed home and was clearly safe, and Clem called him out. And the guy jumps up and he goes, I was safe, I was safe. And Clem very calmly said, if I say you're out, you're out. And that's the court. You know, the Constitution was written to be vague. This idea of a dead Constitution is simply wrong. Again, if you read the words of the delegates, they drafted this Constitution with the understanding that it was going to need to be reinterpreted and revised as conditions changed. But how, so the interpretation of vague language becomes problematic. And so the courts, again, this vacuum was created, and the courts can say anything they want. To me, regardless of how you feel about the immigration crisis, this is one where Abbott is trying to put pressure on the federal government, which is probably, whether it's justified or not, this should not be a tough one. But in terms of whether or not they can start to do it, while the case is being adjudicated, nobody seemed to want to make that decision. So that's what's going on there. Yes?
I guess I got two questions. First of all, if you go back to the Electoral College, if you were the judge, jury, and the voter today, is the Electoral College something that we need in today's world, or is there something else that you would suggest? My other question is, when you take a look at the Nevada law about trying to prohibit people voting for Trump and what the Supreme Court came up with, what would be your thoughts on that?
Okay. The answer to both questions are pretty much the same. I think if we are a democracy, now, many people say we're not a democracy, we're a republic, which is true. A republic meaning representative government, democracy means everybody gets to vote. But those terms are kind of hazy. If we are going to be a nation of majority rule, then to me, the only way to do that is to give everyone an equal vote. And in the Electoral College, everyone does not have an equal vote. You know, right now, for example, the Senate, which bears very strongly on the Electoral College, because every state gets 2 electoral votes for their senators, 52 senators are represented by 18% of the population. So that means that less than 1/5 of the eligible of Americans control the Senate. And that, of course, translates to the Electoral College. To me, once they did not allow a popular vote, and with common standards, which answers the second part of your question, everyone has tried to contrive voting rights. I'll give you one example. The 15th Amendment is drafted and ratified in 1870. And it says that no one will be denied the right to vote on basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And it was drafted specifically to ensure the voting rights of these 4 million newly freed African Americans, these newly freed slaves. In a lawsuit, in a circuit court opinion in a case called Cruikshank versus the United States, which was a massacre in Louisiana, Associate Justice Bradley, in circuit, they used to sit on circuit court, he said, the 15th Amendment does not guarantee the right to vote. Only Congress can do that. All the 15th Amendment does is prohibit the right to vote from being denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so he basically, so what he did was he took the burden of proof away from the states to demonstrate that they had not discriminated and put it on the individual voter to prove that he, always he at that time, had been discriminated against. And that proved to be impossible. And ultimately, it led to a series of other decisions which brought in Jim Crow and denied voting rights to black Americans basically until the Civil Rights Act. So for me, only a standardized, if we have national elections, everybody's vote should have the same weight and everybody should have the same right to vote. If we are going to deny someone the right to vote because their signature doesn't match, fine. That's got to work for everybody. If we are going to deny the right to vote for someone because he had committed a felony, fine, as long as it works for everybody. If we are going to deny the right to vote, as they did in Arizona, on the insurrectionist clause, then those rules have to be set out specifically. So for me, it's not a question of which candidate or which party is the beneficiary or getting hurt by these laws. It is the problem that we have no standards that give people trust. And so you can ask that kind of question about Nevada, and someone else will ask the question about Georgia. And we have those questions. In Georgia, they disenfranchised 53,000 voters 6 years ago simply because they hadn't voted previously, and they made them re-register basically without telling them. So these abuses are on both sides, with both sides jockeying to try to get advantage. That's always going to happen. I'm not naive. But we can limit that. We could have limited that by a more aggressive means of establishing voting rights. Yes, sir.
A couple of questions, too.
Certainly.
First of all, the Constitution was written an awful long time ago. The world has changed.
Yep.
The conditions of the human race, of economy, of electricity, all sorts of things. How effective an instrument do you think it is today? Is it obsolete? Are there better equivalent documents of government out there? That's question number one.
Okay.
Question number two, how can you negate the Electoral College without negating the U.S. Senate? Because it's exactly the same thing, that the voting power of the individual is diminished in the big states.
That's right, yeah.
The Senate, it's exactly the Senate situation is really the equivalent of the Electoral College.
Okay, to answer the second one, you don't have to abolish the Senate. All you would have to do is abolish the Electoral College and institute a popular vote. But that's not going to happen. Now, to talk about all I can say is that if we think that the Constitution was inadequate to deal with the problems of 2024, it was inadequate to deal with the problems of 1787. You know, again, you are dealing with a document that was written under stress by people who were desperate to do something to enable the country to raise money, to have commerce with foreign nations, where the nations were resisting, were to speak with one voice, and to have, well, a standing army, that's another issue, and that bears directly on the Second Amendment. No, Fred. So it is an inadequate document. The problem is, what do you do about it? If you have a second constitutional convention, how do you work it? Is the voting going to be by state, like the first one? Is it going to, how do you get delegates? So I wrote a column a long time ago. I said, America desperately needs a new constitution, and it would be a big mistake to try to get one. So, you know, we are stuck. We are stuck with what we've got, and the only way to do it is, I'll be Pollyanna here, is for people of goodwill on both sides of the political spectrum to recognize that this country cannot prosper without at least starting to listen to each other and to start recognizing that not every point of view that's held by someone they disagree with is idiotic or tyrannical. You know, I'm a centrist. My own politics, I'm relatively conservative in some things, I'm relatively liberal in others. And I look on both sides and I see shrill denunciations, and what I don't see.
How do we get there? We all
You know,
Have you joined no labels yet?
no. Third party is very tricky. You know, the whole political party thing, if you buy the book, whatever you think it is, it's a third party. And again, the rise of political parties was totally not anticipated. If you read Federalist 10, James Madison talking about this is the system that will avoid partisanship. I have a whole chapter in the book on what happened with political parties. So in the end, how do we do it? I don't know. But what I would like to do is I would like, you know, I don't know what the political makeup of this room is, but we're in Florida, so I'm assuming some of you are conservative and some of you are liberal. I would like more, you got to start with more of this. You have to start small. People have to start grouping together and saying, hey, let's listen to each other. And it's hard. So the answer is, I wish I knew, because the way we are working now, we are working as a country that is going to move itself toward irrelevancy. Other countries out there have greater will. And if we don't get that, you know, we're still most powerful, best educational system. We have enormous resources. I hope we don't squander them. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the Second Amendment, in order to join a militia, was that just erased and gone away?
For those of you, we had a little cocktail party last night, and Fred and I had a long discussion. I was gratified that he came to agree with me. Here's the deal with the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment's all about a standing army. All right? In the debates, if you read them, there was a lot of discussion about a standing army. But nobody wanted Washington wanted a standing army desperately. He wanted West Point. He presented a program to Congress to have a standing army. The states didn't want it. They thought a standing army would threaten their own abilities to self-govern. So if you don't have a standing army, then what do you have? Well, you have states. Militia, let's call them the National Guard. You had 13 National Guards available if there was an invasion, if there was a threat, to be called up to turn into a national army. They finally agreed to have a small national army. And then you say, well, okay, you got all these 13 National Guards, how are they going to fight? Well, they need weapons. The country was broke. Nobody was going to buy them. There were proposals, by the way, to have state militias armed by the federal government so they'd all have the same gun, so they could train people, so they could actually fight as a unit. And that was nixed. So we left the Constitutional Convention with no standing army and very vague rules about militias. And in the first Congress, there was a proposal made, the second, which turned into the Second Amendment. It actually was the fourth. There were 12 amendments, and 10 of them were adopted. Actually 11, but one not until 1973. That's about raising pay. You ended up with this amendment. In the Constitutional Convention, they had a provision that said the right of the free, to have bear arms, trained to arms. It was the Second Amendment pretty much as it came out, but there was a clause, trained to arms. Now, if that were actually in the Second Amendment, a lot of the Second Amendment law would change, because you could require training. So you could have strict laws, you could have licensing. Now, there are those who think that we already have sufficient gun laws, but you are allowed, the country would have been allowed, and the federal government would have been allowed, and state governments would have been allowed to draft gun safety laws. You know, the left has done two very smart things. Left-wing messaging is notoriously dreadful, but they have changed pro-choice, which is a very unfortunate term, to reproductive rights, which has worked, and they've changed gun control to gun safety. So let's say gun safety. So you could have gun safety laws if that phrase had been implemented. Now, for me, as we talked about last night, I think that ignoring the first clause, as Scalia did in D.C. v. Heller, when he said it wasn't the controlling clause, I think that's a stretch, and that's how you manipulate language. But I think it was the lack of a specific definition of what constituted a militia and how they would be called up and how they would be armed that got us into this. Anyone else?
I have, yeah.
One last question.
I just want your opinion about our former president. He seems to be ignoring.
Which one?
The former one.
Well, we have
Previous.
Previous.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. And
Anyway,
anyway,
talking about Obama.
He's ignoring the Constitution. He's always being accused of ignoring or trying to overthrow the Constitution. Is he in fact doing that, or is he just interpreting it and using the elastic and plastic nature of the Constitution?
I'm not going to answer that one. I would say that every politician on both sides, and perhaps Donald Trump more than most, tries to use the Constitution to promote their own political point of view. But other than that, that level of partisanship I don't want to get into. But thank you for trying to trap me. Thank you all.